The church fell silent as the bride's father stepped to the microphone, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm sorry, everyone, but our hired singer just called in sick. We don't know what to do." 200 wedding guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, watching as tears began to form in Sarah's eyes. This was supposed to be the perfect day, and now everything was falling apart. That's when a quiet voice from the back of the church spoke up. "I could sing for her." Everyone turned to see Oliver Thompson, the church janitor, still holding his mop bucket. The groom's family exchanged mortified glances. The bride's mother whispered urgently to her husband. But what happened next would leave not a single dry eye in that sacred space and change how everyone in that room thought about judging a man by his appearance. But to understand how this moment came to be, we have to go back to where Oliver's story truly began. 3 years earlier, Oliver had been living a completely different life. He was a music teacher at Jefferson Elementary, coming home every evening to his wife Elena and their 8-year-old daughter Lucy. Their small apartment was always filled with music. Elena humming Spanish lullabies while cooking dinner, Lucy practicing piano scales, and Oliver working on arrangements for the school choir. Music wasn't just Oliver's profession, it was the language their family spoke to each other. Elena would often joke that Oliver could make anyone cry with his voice, even the toughest fourth graders who claimed they didn't like boring classical music. But life has a way of changing the melody without warning. Elena had been feeling tired for weeks, dismissing it as stress from her job at the hospital. When she finally went to see a doctor, the diagnosis hit their family like a discordant crash of cymbals. Stage 3 breast cancer. Advanced, aggressive. The doctors gave her 6 months, maybe 8 if she responded well to treatment. Oliver threw himself into caring for Elena, taking leave from teaching to drive her to chemotherapy appointments, holding her hand through the nausea, and trying to keep Lucy's world as normal as possible. But normal had become a luxury they could no longer afford. The medical bills piled up faster than their savings could cover them. Oliver watched their dreams drain away with each treatment, each experimental drug, each desperate attempt to buy more time. Elena fought with the strength of a warrior, but the cancer fought harder. She passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, with Oliver holding her hand and Lucy curled up beside her on the hospital bed. The last thing Elena said was, "Keep singing, mi amor. Promise me you'll keep singing." Oliver nodded through his tears, but deep down he wondered how he could ever sing again when his heart felt so broken. After the funeral, reality hit like a sledgehammer. The medical debt was crushing. Oliver had used up all his leave and lost his teaching position. Their apartment was too expensive without Elena's income, and Lucy needed stability, needed food, needed a father who could provide for her. So Oliver swallowed his pride and took the first job he could find, custodial work at various locations around the city. The transformation was jarring. One day he was Mr. Thompson, the beloved music teacher who inspired children to find their voices. The next, he was just Oliver, the quiet janitor who cleaned up after others. He worked at the elementary school during the day, watching his former colleagues hurry past him in the hallways, their eyes filled with pity and discomfort. In the evenings, he cleaned offices downtown, and on weekends, he took on additional jobs, including custodial work at St. Mary's Church. Lucy struggled with the changes. She missed her mother terribly, and now her father seemed like a ghost of the man he used to be. Oliver had stopped singing entirely. The piano in their tiny new apartment, the only thing they'd managed to keep from their old life, sat silent, gathering dust. When Lucy asked why Daddy didn't sing anymore, Oliver would change the subject or find some cleaning task that suddenly needed his attention. The other parents at Lucy's new school looked at Oliver differently now. When he picked her up in his janitor's uniform, smelling of cleaning supplies and exhaustion, they whispered behind his back, "Poor little girl," they'd say. "Such a shame what happened to her family." Lucy felt their stares and learned to be embarrassed by her father's work, even though she loved him desperately. At St. Mary's Church, Oliver found a strange kind of peace in the quiet work. He'd arrive early Saturday mornings to clean the sanctuary, vacuum the burgundy carpets, and polish the wooden cues until they gleamed. Father Miguel, the elderly priest, was kind to him, often stopping to chat about Lucy or ask how he was managing. But Oliver kept their conversations brief and professional. He wasn't ready to open up about the music that had once defined his life, or the promise he'd made to Elena that felt impossible to keep. One Saturday morning, while Oliver was cleaning the altar area, he heard someone practicing on the church's old piano. The melody was familiar, Ave Maria, but the performance was clunky, missing the emotional depth the piece deserved. Oliver paused in his work, listening as the pianist struggled through the same difficult passage repeatedly. Without thinking, he began to hum along, his voice naturally finding the harmony that would complement the melody. "Excuse me," a woman's voice called out. Oliver turned to see Mrs. Patterson, the church's music director, looking at him with surprise. "Was that you humming?" Oliver immediately went back to his cleaning. "Sorry, ma'am, I didn't mean to disturb you." No. Patterson said, walking closer. "That was beautiful. Do you have musical training?" "I used to teach music," Oliver said quietly, not looking up from polishing the brass candlesticks. Mrs. Patterson studied him for a moment. Would you consider helping our choir? We're struggling with some of the more challenging pieces, and it sounds like you have an ear for harmony." Oliver shook his head quickly. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm just here to clean." But Mrs. Patterson didn't give up easily. Over the following weeks, she would time her practice sessions to coincide with Oliver's cleaning schedule. She'd play pieces she knew were challenging, hoping to draw out that beautiful voice she'd heard. Sometimes, despite himself, Oliver would hum along quietly. Mrs. Patterson pretended not to notice, but she was carefully listening, recognizing a trained voice when she heard one. Meanwhile, Lucy was facing her own struggles at school. The other children had learned about her family's situation, and some weren't kind about it. "Your dad's just a janitor," Melissa Hartwell had said during lunch. "My mom says that's what happens when people don't work hard enough." Lucy had run to the bathroom and cried, wishing desperately that her father was still the confident music teacher she remembered. That evening, Lucy asked Oliver a question that broke his heart. "Daddy, why don't you teach music anymore? Did you forget how?" Oliver knelt down to meet her eyes. "I didn't forget, sweet pea. It's just, sometimes when we lose someone we love, the music inside us gets very quiet." "But Mama said you promised to keep singing," Lucy whispered. Oliver felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "I know she did, baby. I'm trying." The next Saturday at church, Oliver was cleaning the sanctuary when he overheard Mrs. Patterson on the phone. She sounded frustrated and worried. "I understand, Mr. Williams, but the wedding is tomorrow morning. You can't just cancel on us now. Yes, I know you're sick, but what am I supposed to tell the bride?" Oliver continued his work, but he could feel Mrs. Patterson's distress from across the room. After she hung up, she sat heavily in the front pew, her head in her hands. "Everything okay, ma'am?" Oliver found himself asking. Mrs. Patterson looked up, her eyes red with stress. Our soloist for tomorrow's wedding just canceled. Sarah Mitchell. You might know her father. He owns the hardware store downtown. She specifically requested How Great Thou Art for her ceremony. It was supposed to be the moment when her father gives her away. Now I don't know what to tell them." Oliver knew the song well. It had been one of Elena's favorites, one she'd often request when he played piano in the evenings. The memory hit him like a wave, but instead of the usual pain, he felt something else, a stirring of the music that had been sleeping inside him. "What about the choir?" Oliver asked. "They're good for hymns, but this requires a trained soloist, someone who can handle the emotional weight of the moment." Mrs. Patterson paused. "You know, when I heard you humming a few weeks ago, I thought, but I'm sure you wouldn't be interested." Oliver was quiet for a long moment, his hands still holding the cleaning cloth. He thought about Elena's last words, about Lucy's question, about the promise he'd made and broken every day since. "I could do it," he said quietly. Mrs. Patterson looked up sharply. "Really? I mean, I'd need to practice it once, make sure I remember it properly. But yes, I could sing for the wedding." The next morning, Oliver arrived at the church earlier than usual. He'd spent the night going over the lyrics, remembering the melody, feeling the old familiar stirring in his chest that came before a performance. Lucy had helped him pick out his cleanest shirt, and she'd given him a hug that morning. "Mama would be proud," she'd whispered. Now, as the wedding guests filled the sanctuary, Oliver felt the familiar pre-performance nerves. He'd positioned himself in the back of the church, planning to step forward when the moment came. But as he watched the elegant crowd, women in designer dresses, men in expensive suits, the bride's family clearly well-to-do, he began to doubt himself. Sarah Mitchell looked radiant in her wedding dress, but Oliver could see the worry in her eyes when her father made the announcement about the missing singer. The groom's mother, Mrs. Davidson, was whispering urgently to her husband. "This is exactly what I was afraid of with this venue," she hissed. "We should have insisted on the cathedral downtown." That's when Oliver stepped forward and offered to sing. The reaction was immediate and uncomfortable. Mrs. Davidson's eyes widened in horror. Several guests turned to stare at the janitor who dared to insert himself into their perfect day. Oliver could hear the whispers starting. "Is he serious?" someone muttered. "Who does he think he is?" whispered another. The bride's father, Mr. Mitchell, looked torn between desperation and embarrassment. Sarah's eyes were filling with tears, and Oliver realized she was more upset about the reaction to his offer than the original problem. "I appreciate the gesture," Mr. Mitchell said carefully, "but perhaps we should just proceed without music." "No." The voice was small but firm. Sarah stepped forward, looking directly at Oliver. "If this man is willing to help on my wedding day, then I want to hear him sing." Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Have you ever seen someone surprise you with an unexpected talent? Oliver walked slowly toward the front of the church, aware of every eye in the sanctuary following him. His janitor's uniform felt heavy under their scrutiny. He could hear Mrs. Davidson whispering to her husband, "This is a disaster." An absolute disaster. But then Oliver reached the front of the church and turned to face the congregation. He looked out over the sea of skeptical faces, the whispered conversations, the barely concealed disdain. He thought about Elena, about Lucy, about the promise he'd made and the music he'd buried under grief and shame. He opened his mouth and began to sing. "O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made." The first notes rang out clear and powerful, filling the sanctuary with a richness that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth itself. Oliver's voice had always been his gift, but 3 years of pain and loss had added layers to it that hadn't been there before. The grief was audible, but so was the hope, a hard-won hope that only comes after surviving the worst life can throw at you. The whispers stopped immediately. Mrs. Davidson's mouth fell open. The bride's tears, which had been tears of disappointment, transformed into something else entirely. I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe displayed. Oliver's voice soared on the high notes, and several people gasped audibly. This wasn't just good singing. This was the kind of voice that belonged on concert stages, in grand cathedrals, on recording albums. How was it possible that this man, this janitor they dismissed without a second thought, possessed such extraordinary talent? Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art! How great thou art! By now, there wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. The bride was crying openly, but her tears were joyful. Her father had his hand over his heart, staring at Oliver in amazement. Even Mrs. Davidson had stopped whispering and was listening with her mouth slightly open. But Oliver wasn't singing for them anymore. As his voice filled the sacred space, he felt Elena's presence as surely as if she were standing beside him. He was singing for her, for the promise he'd made, for the music that had always lived inside him and could never truly die. He was singing for Lucy, who needed to see that her father was still the man he'd always been, even when life had knocked him down. The second verse came even more powerfully than the first. Oliver's voice had found its full strength now, and he let it carry all the emotion he'd been holding back for 3 years. The congregation sat in stunned silence, many of them crying without even realizing it. And when I think that God, his Son not sparing, sent him to die, I scarce can take it in. Father Miguel, who had been standing at the altar, had tears streaming down his face. He'd known Oliver was hurting, but he'd never imagined the depth of beauty the man carried inside him. Mrs. Patterson was openly weeping, thinking of all the times she'd tried to coax this voice out of hiding. As Oliver reached the final chorus, something extraordinary happened. The congregation, which had started the morning looking down on him, slowly began to stand. One by one, then row by row, they rose to their feet in a spontaneous ovation that grew as his voice soared. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art! How great thou art! The final note hung in the air like a prayer, and the silence that followed was profound. No one moved, no one breathed. The beauty of what they just experienced had transformed not just the wedding ceremony, but every person in that room. Then Sarah began to clap, and the entire congregation erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old church. People were standing, crying, clapping, and looking at Oliver with expressions of amazement and shame. Amazement at what they just witnessed, and shame at how quickly they judged him. Mrs. Davidson was the first to approach Oliver after the ceremony. "Sir, I owe you an apology," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I was wrong about you, completely wrong." "You don't owe me anything," Oliver said quietly. "I was happy to help." "No, you don't understand," she continued. "I've heard professional singers at Lincoln Center who couldn't move me the way you just did. Where did you train? Where do you perform?" Oliver smiled sadly. "I used to teach elementary school music. Now I clean buildings and raise my daughter. Sometimes that's just how life works out." Word of Oliver's performance spread through the small town faster than gossip usually travels. By Monday morning, his phone was ringing with opportunities he hadn't dreamed possible. The local community theater wanted him to audition for their lead role. The high school music department offered him a substitute teaching position. Mrs. Patterson begged him to consider joining the church choir permanently. But perhaps the most meaningful call came from Jefferson Elementary, his old school. The principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, had heard about what happened at the wedding from 3 different sources. "Oliver," she said, "I know we had to let you go when you took leave for Elena's illness, but we've had such a hard time finding someone to fill your position properly. The children ask about you all the time. Would you consider coming back? We can work with your schedule, help you transition back gradually." For the first time in 3 years, Oliver felt hope stirring in his chest. "I'd like that very much," he said. That evening, Oliver sat at the dusty piano in their small apartment. Lucy curled up beside him on the bench, just like she used to do when she was smaller. "Daddy, will you play something for me?" she asked. Oliver's fingers found the keys, and for the first time since Elena's death, music filled their home again. He played one of Elena's favorite songs, a gentle Spanish lullaby she used to hum while cooking dinner. Lucy leaned against his shoulder and smiled. "Mama would be so happy," she whispered. "Yeah, sweet pea," Oliver said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think she would be." The story of Oliver Thompson spread beyond their small town. Someone had recorded his performance on their phone and posted it online, where it quickly went viral. "Janitor's wedding performance leaves everyone in tears" became the headline that introduced millions of people to Oliver's voice. Record labels started calling, talk show producers wanted interviews. But Oliver was cautious about the attention. He'd learned that life could change in an instant, and he wanted to make sure that whatever path he chose would be stable for Lucy. He did accept a few opportunities: a performance at the state fair, a guest appearance with the city symphony, and eventually a small recording contract that allowed him to work from home and maintain his teaching schedule. But he never forgot the lesson of that Sunday morning at St. Mary's Church. Share if you've ever experienced something similar. Have you been judged based on appearances only to surprise people later? The real transformation wasn't just in Oliver's career prospects, but in how the community saw him and how he saw himself. Parents who had once whispered about poor Lucy and her janitor father now looked at him with respect and admiration. Lucy walked taller at school, proud of her dad in a way she'd never been before. More importantly, Oliver had found his voice again, not just literally, but figuratively. He realized that losing Elena didn't mean he had to lose the parts of himself she had loved most. The music had always been there, waiting patiently through the grief and the struggle, ready to emerge when he was strong enough to let it. 6 months later, Oliver was invited back to St. Mary's Church for another wedding. This time, he arrived as the featured soloist, wearing a proper suit and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his worth. But when he saw the young janitor in the back of the church, a teenager working his way through community college, Oliver made sure to introduce himself and shake the young man's hand. "Thank you for keeping this place beautiful," Oliver told him. "It's important work." The young man smiled, clearly surprised that someone had noticed him, much less thanked him. Oliver remembered that feeling and was glad he could pass on a different experience. As Oliver took his place at the front of the church that day, he looked out over another congregation of wedding guests. But this time, he didn't see judgment in their eyes. He saw anticipation, respect, and excitement for what they were about to experience. He thought about Elena's last words, "Keep singing, mi amor. Promise me you'll keep singing." He'd kept that promise, even when it seemed impossible. Even when the music felt buried too deep to ever find again. The bride nodded to him, and Oliver began to sing. His voice filled the sanctuary with the same power and beauty that had surprised everyone 6 months earlier. But now it was tempered with the wisdom that comes from learning that sometimes our greatest gifts emerge not in spite of our struggles, but because of them. After the ceremony, as guests approached to congratulate him and ask for autographs, Oliver remembered something Elena used to tell him when he doubted himself. The heart that has truly grieved knows how to truly celebrate. The voice that has cried out in pain knows how to lift others up in joy. She had been right, as she so often was. His journey through loss and humiliation and back to hope had made him not just a better singer, but a better man. The janitor's uniform had been shed, but the humility and work ethic it represented remained. Would you have had the courage to step forward like Oliver did? Let us know in the comments below. Today, Oliver teaches music again at Jefferson Elementary, where his students adore him not just for his incredible voice, but for the way he sees potential in every child, especially the quiet ones who think they don't have anything special to offer. He still performs at weddings and community events, but his favorite audience will always be a classroom full of children discovering their own voices for the first time. Lucy, now 11, plays piano beautifully and has inherited her father's gift for music. More than that, she's inherited his understanding that true strength isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up and continuing to sing, even when your heart feels broken. Sometimes Oliver still takes custodial jobs on weekends, not because he needs the money anymore, but because he never wants to forget what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be judged by appearance rather than character. Those experiences made him more compassionate, more humble, and ultimately more human. The lesson Oliver learned that Sunday morning at St. Mary's Church is one we all need to remember. We never know what gifts the people around us are carrying, what struggles they're facing, or what beautiful surprises they might offer if we're willing to look past the surface and listen with our hearts instead of our prejudices. Elena's promise, "Keep singing, mi amor," had been about more than just music. It was about keeping hope alive, maintaining dignity in the face of hardship, and never allowing circumstances to define the depths of who you are. Oliver had learned that sometimes we have to be broken open before the most beautiful parts of ourselves can emerge. Family isn't just about blood relations, but about the people who see your worth when the world has decided you have none. Love isn't measured by status or wealth, but by the courage to step forward when someone needs you, even when it might cost you dignity or comfort. And sometimes the most powerful moments of our lives come not when we're at our highest point, but when we choose to rise up from our lowest. The janitor who dared to sing that day taught everyone in St. Mary's Church that we should never judge a book by its cover. Never assume we know someone's story based on their job title, and never underestimate the power of one voice raised in service to another's joy. In a world quick to categorize and dismiss, Oliver Thompson proved that the most extraordinary gifts often come wrapped in the most ordinary packages. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and click on the video on the screen to watch the next one with a twist so powerful you'll never forget it.